Welcome back to ManaTutor MTG Draft. In a recent episode, we mentioned we'd follow up with a retrospective of what we got right and wrong about Aetherdrift Draft from our pre-release predictions. We've noticed other content creators like Limited Resources and Nizzahon giving their retrospectives this week. It seems we're going to follow in their footsteps, as today's the day we give our retrospective. And we'll start off with a few things that we got right. And first off, I think we got the big picture and the set mechanics right. For example, we did say the pace of the set would be a slower set, and this is a slower set than every set we've seen since Brothers War in 2022.
Yeah, it's a very slow set, and I think that came as a shock to a lot of people. I think there really is no aggro archetype in this set. I mean, I think if you're gonna have one that comes close, it's either red white or red green. But even with
Red
those,
black
like
too. Red black is actually a viable one,
red
but
black, yeah.
it, it's sort of more mid-rangey. It's not like I see why you don't necessarily classify it as aggro, because it's just like aggro compared to the other decks in the format.
Right. And even that, like I mean, I played a red green recently where I think one game I won on turn 6, and I was like, wow, that was fast.
That is fast for this format.
Like, but that was like one game, and the only reason I won is I had the 7/7 vigilance trample that gives your whole board +2/+2 in vigilance trample. And I managed to be able to play that on turn 6. It cost 6, and so like and then my opponent conceded because like I was about to win, but that was like the first game I think I've won before turn 8. So yeah, it's slow. It's very slow. So and kind of in that vein, another thing I think we called right is that max speed is a little underpowered as a mechanic. Not to say it's useless, right? But I think we talked about this. We talked about how, and I think you made the point, Jeremy, that you thought it was going to be less important than the ring tempt from Lord of the Rings, right? Like it's a similar type mechanic, but it at the end of the day, it only matters once you hit max. In most cases, whereas the ring tempt, you kind of got a bonus at every single level, right? And so it was like even getting to level 1 was fine, but with max speed, you really need to get to max speed, and so it's very binary in that respect in most cases, and like the cards that give a benefit for it, like the benefit is not as good as with some of those ring tempt. When the ring tempts you, do X, right? Like so I think overall it's not as useful as some of the other mechanics we've seen recently. Although I mean there are some really good cards that have really great max speed benefits. And if you can build a deck around that, if you can build a deck that can get to max speed reliably and consistently, then it's probably pretty good. But I just think that I think we called that one right overall.
Yeah, and I think we called even the details of that one right in that comparing to the ring tempt had an inherent mechanic that will help you even when your cards do not say ring tempt, or
Right.
like it doesn't need max speed. Like whereas this set needs cards that say max speed, it would give like a given creature a ability that doesn't necessarily say like it needs to
Right.
comply
I mean,
to
it
the
gave you a
format
loot
mechanic,
mechanic
right?
at level 1 on your ring bearer, right? Like,
Yeah,
so it was
yeah.
like, just inherently, that's a really good mechanic that whenever you attack, draw and discard. So,
Yeah, but we
that
also
was
did say max speed would, it'll end some games, right? And I do
right.
think we see that out in like black red, like Streaking Oral Gorger in the last video mentioned that you can make a viable black red deck
Right.
just off of max speed and that, for example. So, it does win some games, but it is less prevalent than the other mechanics or that are in this set, or even
Right.
compared to like the ring temp, for example, in other sets.
Right. Another similarly, when we were talking mechanics, I think we said in one of our in like our early preview video that we thought exhaust was going to be pretty good, and exhaust is pretty good.
I think it's
Um,
the most important mechanic in this
yeah.
format, right? Like you need mana sinks to
Yes.
really get as much value as you can out of your cards. We were just talking about right before this a
Off
couple of our
camera. Yeah.
favorite cards. So, we chat for 5 minutes before we start our episodes. We talked about Stampeding Scurryfoot and the Sky Streak Engineer,
Yes.
both cards that play early and then exhaust to have a bigger effect later on. So exhaust is very prevalent and important. We also mentioned, though, that 1 and 2 drops, there weren't that many that were great, right? They weren't the most impressive looking at 1 and 2 drop. There are some notable exceptions in that,
Scurry
but
foot. Yeah.
yep, Furyfoot, yeah. Um, and then Engine Rat, for example, yeah.
Yeah.
But still, 1 and 2 drops were not overly impressive this round.
Right.
And
Yeah.
we called that correctly from the format overview perspective. I think we'll talk when we get a little bit more into how we graded things. We kind of graded things a bit differently than we expected the format to play out. So there is a little bit of like two different sides of the coin of how we treated this set, but
Right. A couple other one drops, so to speak, to call out Grim Bauble. I think we said though that like we thought that that was going to be really good, and it absolutely is. One that we didn't mention though, Scrap Compactor. Scrap Compactor is actually, a very viable card. I would not classify it as filler in most cases. I mean, I think it's not your premium removal, but it's very viable. To play that on your 1-drop when you've got nothing else to play for your mana, and then it's just a 3 mana, do 3 damage, which is not amazing, but it's not terrible. Or a 6 mana, kill anything, right? And so both of those use cases for it are really good. Plus, it gets an artifact in graveyard for things that care about that. And so, so that's another one. I don't think we rated it. Either of us rated it very highly, but it is actually a very viable 1-drop.
yeah, I guess the question is, do you define that as a 1-drop? Like, like it is something to play on turn 1, but
Right,
it
right,
takes 4 mana to get the 3 damage,
right.
or 6 mana to get sorry, 7 mana ultimately to get the destroy out
Yes,
of it.
yeah,
So, it is worse removal than we're used to seeing removal, but in a slow set, like the
yeah,
context there matters. And yeah, I'm in over half my decks, I think I'm playing a copy of Scrap Compactor. Another thing that I think we called right is you do need to set your game plan up early.
yeah.
While you don't necessarily need to be attacking in early, you still want to be able to play, something by turn 3.
Mm-hmm.
You don't really want to wait till turn 4 as your first play. And you want to be contributing towards your ultimate game plan. You can't just wait. I mean, honestly, I don't give us too much credit for that take, because modern Magic, like every set, you can't wait till like turn 4 or be extremely slow, right?
Right.
Even if you are a slower controlling deck. But it is something we mentioned that is true.
Yeah, and I think something I find myself doing a lot, especially with the prevalence of exhaust, right, is focusing on how to use my mana most efficiently in every game, right? Like I want to be tapped out, by the time, my opponent's turn ends. Like and I want to do so in a way that is, yeah, obviously protecting myself from getting attacked, getting board presence, all of that. But but there's a lot, I mean, I think there's a lot of balance that I'm finding goes into that with the mechanics like exhaust, where you want to set up, okay, this is my 1-drop, this is my 2-drop, this is my 3-drop, this is my 2 4-drops, or my two cost things that I'm going to do on turn 4 with like because you've got some exhaust things that cost 2 or something like that. I'm thinking of the 2 3 vigilance that cost 2 to draw and discard and put a counter on it. But so I'm finding myself doing a lot of that in terms of when I'm thinking through my game plan every game, with my starting hand, things like that, just thinking about how to use the mana most efficiently. Obviously, a lot of that is reactionary to what my opponent's doing, but I'm finding myself doing more of that in this set, just because you have so many more things to do with mana. And also with with crewing vehicles and stuff, right? And thinking about like how best to crew a vehicle, like when, what creatures to attack in with, what ones to maybe save to crew a vehicle. I think there's just a lot more mechanically going on during a game. Speaking of vehicles, right? So, I think that's another thing that we called right early on, which was that you kind of want to be sparing in your vehicle use, especially with ones that don't come with some sort of crew inherent in them, or don't have an ability to turn themselves into an artifact creature. There's certain ones, right, that have that ability, right, just from the get-go, so you can use them pretty effectively and efficiently. But like the ones that you don't have that with, you want to be sparing with, and you want to make sure that your creature to vehicle or creature to vehicle ratio is good, right?
Right.
And that you're not going to ever find yourself in a position. Now vehicles can be really good. You can get like 5/5s out for 3 mana in some cases, right? But they usually come with a 3 crew cost or something. So it's like, it's a trade-off, and I think we called that pretty early on, that you're going to want to make sure that you're, curving that out, so to speak, correctly.
Yeah.
So, and I think while we kind of broadly missed on some of the rankings of the archetypes, there were a few that I think stood out that we kind of said early on we didn't think were very strong, and that's broadly played out. I would say, white black particularly. It was pretty low in our archetype rankings. I think it might have been second to last, and it's one of the worst performing archetypes right now. So I think that's just well, I think we're going to get into the things that we didn't call right in a minute, and I think the archetypes is kind of part of that. I do think there were a few in there that we were like, does this really do much? Does this really have a thing?
I will say, like, I don't hate white black. Like, I agree that it's not performing the greatest, but I do think that is an archetype where there are a couple different builds of it, and some builds are bad and other builds are better. And I've been liking like the artifact type build with black white, especially if you can splash blue for like Haunt the Network in there too. And then even there is some like streaking oil gorger aspect. Like you can kind of toe the line between the Esper decks of like artifact and the max speed oil gorger type of red black type of effect with white black, and take advantage of the signpost uncommons there. And if you know how to do that right, I think you can build a good black white deck, but I do think it's more complicated than all the other archetypes, and that is bringing down the stats for that deck. And I don't think it's premium either. Even if you do get a good one coming together, it's not. I'd still rather have a lot of my green decks, for example, or even black
green anything, would be like,
yeah.
And I think that's a thing that we can, we'll get into in a minute in terms of color rankings and stuff like that. But
before we get into what we had wrong, though, I do want to look through and kind of remember back to like what we had been getting right in other sets. So we did have a pattern of correctly calling in foundations, for example, that green was nearly unplayable. We said that before it dropped. Same thing for Duskborn. We correctly called black as the weakest color. And in Bloomburrow, we correctly called blue as the weakest color. But I will say in Aetherdrift, we called black as the weakest color, and it's really like second best, right? So that one, we got it wrong. In fact, I'd say we largely did get the set wrong in terms of the color and archetype rankings. And I want to discuss why we got those wrong and if we should change anything in the future to help prevent us from repeating the same mistake that we made for Aetherdrift moving forward in other sets.
So I think there were a number of things we got wrong, right? So first of all, when we were ranking archetypes and stuff, we weren't ranking by our opinion of those archetypes. We were using our card evaluation. So let's start with that. And, if for those who are not familiar with how we rate cards and stuff, I would invite you to maybe check out a link below. I'm sure we can link to, our evaluation for this set, and that'll explain kind of how we rank cards and what our scale is. But basically, we were using those card evaluations and our individual rankings average to identify what we thought were the best archetypes and the worst archetypes. So among some of the things that we got wrong were individual color rankings, as we talked a little bit about before. So one of the things that I think when we rated it, we said red. I think we rated it as the second highest color in our video.
Even first highest color, actually.
Oh, it was first. Okay, so even there. So red is a lot worse than we thought overall, just in terms of, again, from a pure how the cards are playing out rating, not our opinion. So like things like Lightning Strike or Galvanic Blast, which is basically an improved shock, are performing at like C tier, right? And these are normally minimum B minus, right? If not better cards, or the equivalent versions of them. Like every set has basically a shock equivalent and a lightning blast equivalent. Sometimes they're a little bit better, sometimes they're a little bit worse. Things like Road Rage, right? In this set, just not performing at the same level that we would expect.
And the reason red's not performing, though, is because it's not lining up well against the other cards in the set, right? So when we go through and grade, we are doing that as our first pass through and grading each card individually, not in the context of the set. So these cards are not doing nearly as well as they would have in the past, partially because most of the good cards out there have 4 toughness or higher. In some cases, a lot of cases 6 toughness, sometimes 7, and red just doesn't. Most of these red cards aren't hitting those, right?
Right.
And so that's bringing these down to lower grades than I think we've ever seen them since we started the channel, at least. Right?
Where's the one that does 6 damage at? I'm out of curiosity. How's that performing overall? Because I'm actually interested to see. Yeah, crash and burn. Okay, so C minus, right? So that even there is not great, right? 4 damage at instant speed. I think when we did our set review, we are like, we really like this. 6 damage for 4 mana at instant speed, and it can destroy target vehicle in a vehicle based set. Like I think we thought that this was going to be one of like the best comments, and it's a C minus.
I don't know that we called it one of the best comments compared to all those other other good removal spells we had. All those above, but we did say that this would be good compared to this is typically costed at 5 mana plus, right? Yes. And so it is more efficient than we're used to seeing a 6 damage spell. But like none of these, like for Outpace Oblivion, the 3 mana for 5 damage spell, which is usually like B or so, sometimes even B plus, is playing at a C. Like we clearly got this wrong, and the reason we got this wrong is the context of the set. It does not play against the toughness of the creatures correctly that are really winning here.
Right. You've got things like the 9/7 dinosaur, and I'm terrible with card names, so I'm just gonna like I can name abilities, but not the 4/4 worm that with trample that becomes a 7/7 worm with trample. Like none of those things outright kill those things. So so that's where you're running into, I think, a lot of problem with what red normally does with burn spells. Another aspect I think that we miscalled, because I think we had this as our last ranked archetype in the set.
Yep.
Because we thought black was going to be so bad, is that black green is much better than we thought it would be. So the signposts between Broodheart Engine and the other one that is Thundering Broodwagon, right? Those are just performing at really good levels, right? Like you've got A minus Thundering Broodwagon, right? Like I don't think either of us rated that card an A minus. I think I rated it pretty highly, but like it's just such a good card, and it's performing really well. And then you've got support cards in there that really help support the self mill mechanic of like Dredger's Insight, which basically gets you 3 cards in graveyard, something to hand, and just starts gaining you life, right? On paper, those cards don't look amazing, right? You'd think, like, you'd look at a card like Dredger's Insight, I think, in most sets, and even in sets where self mill is a pretty common mechanic in black green, but I think in most sets you'd look at this and you'd say, okay, so you're going to put 4 cards in grave, return 1 to your hand, and for 2 mana, that's basically, sure, it gets you a card, and that's great, but you don't rate those very highly usually. But this card is performing pretty well at a C plus. So it's a slower set though, right? So I think in a slower set, you can afford to set that engine up a little bit. And things like Broodheart Engine, which surveils every turn, really get a chance to pay off, because if you play that on turn 2, you're probably going to get to activate that like 3 or 4 or 5 plus times in a game, and that's going to be great. And then when you want it, it's an amazing ability to just be able to bring back basically anything that you want.
Imagine though, like, so we've had debates over cards that come into play in Scry 2 or Surveil 2, like they're good when they come in with a permanent, right? Like the vehicle that isn't really acting like a creature, the spot cycle for Scry 2 when enters play, right? That's a bad card, right? Well, you'd think, like, what makes this so good? This one's comes into play, Scry 1, get literally no permanent. Yes, it's an artifact, but no vehicle out of it. And then you don't even get to do this.
You don't even get to do the surveil immediately. You have to wait till your next upkeep, right? So it's like even the spot cycle or scries immediately. So you get to see and set it up. You have to wait till your next upkeep, which is fine. But it's a little bit less information you have on your opponent's turn, which is something, right? So anyway,
in a vacuum, you would rate this card low, right? Like I think it's pretty clear to most people for sets in the past 2 years, this card would be low. But in this set, you have the time for this, and the support around it to really be doing this thing, and we missed that. And then the Thundering Broodwagon, I don't think we were horribly down on this card. Like it does read as a good card, but it reads as very mana intensive, right? Like Wind does a 6-drop that does something like this that costs 4 pips. Usually that's a little intensive, but in a slow set, it's not. And then same thing for the Dredger's Insight as well. I would expect Dredger's Insight to be a lot worse than, say, like Squirrel's Nest from Bloomburrow, where you actually get, a food out of it. Like, so another permanent that has food synergies, you get more out of doing it. And Dredger's Insight, you don't. And so it reads, somewhat poor, somewhat slow. But again, in a slow set, it works.
I think there's another thing coming into play with this as well that, I don't think and it's kind of related to what we said about red, right? So in the same way that red's removal is not great in this set, black's removal is better, right? You've got things like Spin Out, which is basically murder, which is good because you get to the point where, that can kill basically anything, whereas red's removal a lot of times, because of the toughness of the creatures, can't. And then you have also things like, and we talked about this, Engine Rat, right? A 1/1 Death Toucher is not necessarily an amazing card, but the fact that it can just block and kill basically anything that at least on the ground that's coming in, even if you take a little bit of trample damage over it or something like that, that's useful, right? And it's got a late game, the late game mechanic's actually really great on that, because it's a great mana sink, and I've definitely won games by just like making my opponent lose 2 life. But black's removal with things like Death Touch, there's also the Maximum Overdrive, which, +1/+1 counter, Death Touch, and Indestructible. These are great removal spells that give you a lasting board impact, right? Like in this case, you get a counter on something, and you get to kill their creature usually for 2 mana, which is really efficient. And so for that reason, I think that's what elevates black in a way that where like red is also diminished, is like these are just outright kill your opponent's stuff. It doesn't matter how much toughness it has.
I remember after doing the grades, then looking over black and saying it has to be a controlling color, right? There was no aggressive creatures really in black. And so I think that's part of what, made us judge black a little lower, is typically black can't wait that long in order to do the controlling thing because the games end soon enough. But when you don't have the aggressive 1 and 2 drop creatures in the set, you have the time to be able to be doing this hard removal, right? And setting up big creatures. And we'll have to keep that in mind moving forward. Like the context of the set really does impact how you should be rating cards. And so I think that kind of brings us into the why we got it wrong.
Yeah.
This set is just very different from previous sets. It wasn't very predictable when evaluating cards in the context of previous sets. I saw drafters and podcasters were saying they find it as a harder set to evaluate. We had people in our comments saying it was harder to evaluate. I'm in Discord channels across all different content creators, and it was pretty common to see that people were having a tough time with this set. And it actually looks like, so we mentioned limited resources, Nizzahon kind of doing their retrospective this week as well. It would be interesting to play some clips of where they also saw this wrong.
Sure, yeah.
Set review wise, right? Like we have been under the assumption that these sets are going to be pressure early, assertive, not necessarily aggressive, but definitely fast and that type of thing. When we come into the set review before we've actually played with the card. Now we've got our hands on a set here that is not fast. Again, that doesn't mean that you get to do nothing, but it is not aggressive. This is not an aggressive format. So with that in mind, many of the cards in the set that, like Paul, we would describe them as like slow cards, right? They're actually a lot better than we would give them credit for. We gave them credit for, I mean.
Yeah, no, completely. I think we thought this format was going to be fast. And I think in a lot of instances where we look at a card and we go, oh, yeah, I mean, you can maybe play 1 copy of this card, but you kind of have to build around it just because it's far too slow. Mm-hmm. Well, that's just not the case. Those cards are all performing much higher than anticipated. So anytime we gave something a grade, I think at the very minimum, for those quote unquote slow cards, not bad cards, slow cards, bump it up like 2/3 of a letter grade, maybe even a full letter grade in a lot of instances, because that's how they've been playing out.
It's a significant amount. It's not a rounding error. It's like, no, this could take it from, from a D to the C range. It could take it from a C to the B range, like a card that you would play most of the time to one that you really want, or a card that you'd rather not play to one that, no, you actually want this card in your deck. It's a big difference.
If you look at Golgari, right, we actually, what's funny is we looked at both of the Golgari uncommons. We're like, these are far too slow, probably not going to be good. They're actually awesome. And then with blue-green, you just don't run out of gas. There's just a ton of good exhaust creatures that people still undervalue that I think are good. You talk about just even cards that don't look that great. Skystreak Engineer, Keen Buccaneer. Those are cards that we initially were like, oh, that's whatever, D+, like filler level cards. Well, guess what? They're both mana sinks. And in this format, that actually matters. And they both just end up performing much better than anticipated.
All right, let's look now at a similar card, Leonin Surveyor. This is one I talked a little bit about last week, and it's become even more true, I think. This is a card where you look at this thing and you were like, in most limited formats, this is an amazing 2-drop. And, that's what I said. I said it was a C+. I said it was potentially White's best common. It's a 2-mana 2/2 that has first strike when it attacks. That already is a solid card because, it attacks reasonably well pretty much all game long. And if you play it on turn 2, it's especially annoying in most formats. That's usually how that would go. Then you have all this other upside because of Start Your Engines, which, by the way, most of the cards that are all in on Start Your Engines in this format also aren't good, just like vehicles aren't, unless they have some sort of, Inter's ability. And I thought, hey, man, this is a 2-mana 2/2 first strike in the early game that eventually gives me a 2-for-1. That's what I said when I saw this. And that's kind of true. It can do those things, but there are a bunch of problems. I've already mentioned how defensive the format is, especially, there being high toughness. It's partly why Lightning Strike, I don't have it on this list, but, it is an underperformer. I'm not talking about every card I was wrong about because it would just be repetitive. And it's probably already getting a little repetitive because I'm saying, like, cheap aggro cards aren't good and expensive, slow value cards are, is basically what I'm saying in this video with some very specific examples. So I don't need to give you even more examples. But, toughness being higher, it's also at the 2-drop slot. There are a bunch of 1/3s in this format that just stonewall this thing. One of the most notable being the 2-mana 1/3 flyer with Surveil 2 when it enters. That card is just an amazing 2-drop because it generates all this value. Like, it's miles better than Leonin Surveyor is in this format with its 51.9% win rate. And yeah, I gave it a C+, said it might be White's best common. It's more like a D-. It's just not really a card you can play very often in a format where it's not a good attacker all that often, like it would be in most formats.
Yeah, basically we graded cards individually and not in the context of the whole set. So after the first grading, we both had the feeling that this set was, we said in the big picture stuff, the set was slower. The problem is we didn't go back and regrade cards under that knowledge, right? And if we did go through a second time and adjust grades, we, under the fact that the set was slower, we probably would have gotten closer to right. In fact, one commenter did say before the set dropped, they found green pretty impressive and being pushed. And I responded to that comment saying, actually, I agree. I don't think our grades accurately reflected how much I like green after looking over the set. Now, I'm not trying to say, like, I don't think if we regraded the set that we would have pushed green and black to the very top, right? Like that's
right. No,
that's
I think we still would have overall thought black was going to be a little bit lackluster. Maybe it wouldn't have been at the bottom like we thought it would be, right? But I don't think we would have thought it was even the second best color. It probably would have fallen like third or fourth. And yeah,
but I'm pretty sure we would have gotten red lower.
Right.
We would have gotten white lower as well.
Right.
And we would have gotten green and black both higher, and blue probably staying about the same. Yeah, so I don't know what the final order would be, and I'm sure it'd be far from being completely what the set is, right? But we're not trying to be perfect in the early set review before a single game is played. We're trying to be directional, and we got that wrong this time. We just need to figure out how we don't repeat that. And so is it going through the list twice? Like, that's a lot of work. We both have
Yeah.
full-time jobs. Like we don't make any money off this channel. We're just doing this
Right.
for fun. So, should we be doing that, or do we maybe, when the set fully spoils, give that a look over first before even grading, right? Like try to get a sense of the whole context of the set and then go grade. Problem being, we like to grade things as they're released in spoiler season bit by bit. So we wouldn't get that head start of like starting our grades. We'd have to basically sit down and grade everything in one sitting and then still get out in time for everyone to view everything. So I don't know what the right answer is. What do you think, Matt?
I mean, I think there's probably some of that. I think, I'm definitely going to start giving things a second look, once I go through and give everything a grade. And I've done this before, like just to see kind of how all my ratings stack up, because I have a tendency to cluster things towards C's. Like
I mean,
I'll do my initial rating of
yeah.
things and I'll be like, wow, like half this color is C's or some form of C, C plus, C or C minus. And I'll go through and I'll just give it a look through again and I'll be like, for each color, right? But I think doing it as a whole set can also, you know, okay, is this green card, that I rated a B minus really equivalent to this black card that I also rated a B minus, or is one of them like
Right.
vastly more powerful in the context of the set, right? That said, right, I think there's only so much you can do that, because you really have to see a set played to really
Yeah.
understand a lot of things about the set. That you can do a mock draft, you can do whatever you want, but like until you actually sit down and play the set, you're not going to get a feel for what works and what doesn't with it, completely at least, right? You can directionally tell certain things, or I think like we said, we thought vehicles, if you have too many vehicles, obviously you're going to run into problems crewing them. These are like obvious things that you can kind of pick up from a review, but there are going to be certain things that even going over it a second time that are going to be kind of, until the set is actually in play, you're not going to know how people are reacting, right?
Yeah.
And what kinds of decks people are managing to put together with the various archetypes.
There were actually 3 phases prior to the set dropping where I had like different opinions of the set. So there was just the initial grade, right, of everything.
Yeah.
That was one opinion, and that's what you saw reflected in our rankings. Then there was okay, we've reviewed everything. We have a feel for the set. Like it feels slower. Oh, that might change how we should have rated things. Like, we didn't put anything out for that though. But
Right.
then there was early access dropped, and I saw a few games played, and I'm like, oh crap, this set is slower. Like we're almost definitely wrong. Should we go make a video about it? And I figured, we can do that once we have our first impressions. Like when the set drops a day after we had a chance to play, then we'll get to put that out there. And I still kind of feel like that probably is the type of cadence we'll still do, because like, I don't know, the episodes there's a lot of time to prep these and, edit them and put them out there, create a thumbnail, all that. Like it takes,
and you're the one who does all that. So,
and I think it's just fine to, see early access, think, oh, we're probably a little bit off, and that's okay, right? Like,
Right.
Still would like to get our grades more accurate earlier on. And I think to do that, we have to have seen the context of the set and do another run through. So maybe it's like, at least this next set, I want to run through twice. And I'm sure it sounds like you want to do the same.
Yeah.
And maybe past that, though, it might be we do a first grading, and then after we're done, we discuss like, was this roughly a normal set or not? And if not, trigger okay, we're gonna have to go through and regrade all these.
Right. Yeah. No. And I think what might be and this is something, obviously like behind the curtain a little bit, but like we don't usually talk about the set much before we both have finished our grading. I mean, like occasionally we'll send each other cards and be like, wow, this card looks insane. And I did that this time with Ride's End, right? Like I think I sent you Ride's End and I was like, wow, this card seems incredibly overpowered.
Yeah.
Turns out white is not a great color.
Well, Ride's End
overall.
is still good.
Right.
But
Ride's
yeah.
End is still a good card, clearly. But, that doesn't, I thought white was going to be a good color in this set, right? Like just from seeing like commons like that, right? But the fact of the matter is it's not. So, but we don't really talk about that a lot. So what might be, something you and I can do, is, just chat about like, hey, what are like based on our rankings and what we saw before we see the data on it, just like what do we think are going to be the better archetypes and the worst archetypes? Like, not even going through all 10, but like it could be a thing that you and I do before we like actually get the hard numbers, right? Because I
Yeah.
think that will like give us and compare notes, right? Because that'll give us a little bit of a, I think, baselining, right, before we actually sit down and like run numbers on things.
Yeah, and then even the, our archetype and color rankings are based on the grades exclusively, right?
Right.
We don't shuffle that
There's
around
no
to like,
vibes. There's no
yeah,
vibes included.
there's people have a vibe usually. That's how they're grading in general, right? And we don't. We're trying to be not biased, and I mean, obviously the grading evaluation is biased, right? Like we're
Right.
giving our grades to that, but
Yeah.
then we lay out the numbers and let the numbers speak to like how they look, and then we might say like, oh, this could be wrong because we don't quite feel that the numbers reflect how this will actually play out because
Right.
we don't believe in the mechanic that archetype is based on, or whatever, right? But so maybe, I don't know, we could lay out like, here's what the data says and here's what we think, but I don't
Right.
know if that's going to be so much different. We might just want to like lay out with the data and then say, I'm still skeptical of the following if it's high up, or like, I know this is low, but the mechanic looks pretty good. So like this
Right.
might be raised up sort of thing, and just mention that more.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think just thinking through it, and as you and I are like grading sets, and before we sit down and actually talk about them on camera, right? Like you and
Yeah.
I can maybe go back and forth a little bit on where we think certain archetypes might rank, right? Yeah, I mean, I think this was just a hard set, and I'm not sure that it necessarily means every other set after this is going to be difficult. I think, depends on what the mechanics look like. I've seen a number of cards spoiled, I think, from the Final Fantasy set that's not coming up until June. That looks like, I think it'll be more basic, although there is a new it's a new saga type that's coming out. It's like summons, right? From if you've played the Final Fantasy games, you know what those are, but they perform like sagas and creatures, which is an interesting, mechanic, like creatures that only stick around for 3 or 4 turns, maybe, and have an effect every upkeep. So that'll be an interesting thing to look at. I don't think it's going to be as difficult as some of the things that we encountered in this set with the mass amount of vehicles, right? So thank you for joining us for our initial retrospective for Aetherdrift. We want to be honest and upfront when we, get things wrong. Talk about it a little bit. Talk about maybe why it happened. We're going to do more of these for upcoming sets as well. Next, we think what we'll do is give a little bit of a given how different and unique this set is. We want to talk a little bit about combos and how to draft based on what else you're seeing in your draft pod and your card pool and things like that, and how that might affect some of your choices up and down the line as you draft. Thinking things like, bounce off, bouncing your own creatures, things like that. Your own creatures with exhaust that you want to reuse, right? So stay tuned. We hope you'll join us next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and tell us what you thought of the video. If you think we got some other things right or wrong, let us know in the comments below. And we hope to see you in the next one.
See you in the next one.
See you next one.